the marriage of the Lamb. Sorry, not the marriage of the the marriage of the Lamb. The last part of chapter 6, and then in terms of chapter 7, we'll probably won't start that until I was going to start that tonight, because this part that we're doing will probably take half an hour at the most, but um, we're only going to do that tonight, so we'll start 7 afresh and should finish 7 next week. Anyway, let's start with what we're going to be teaching on tonight, and it's still part of the eschatology, or the study of the invisible church, and it's regards to the. Oh, somebody's going crazy on the. Okay. I'll just switch that off. Anyway, let's look at what we're covering tonight. So tonight we're finishing off chapter 6, which is a study of the last part of the invisible church, which we already covered the rapture last week. And then tonight we're going to look at the other aspect of after we received our rewards or reward ceremony. We're now going to go through what they call the marriage of the Lamb. The marriage of the Lamb there. So, and then of course after this chapter 7, which will cover some of the other events in the tribulation. Like we said, to actually get a better understanding of this part of the chapter in terms of the marriage of the Lamb, let's look at the Jewish wedding system. Now, some of us have already done this study, but it's good for us to go get a refresher from it, So let's look at the Jewish wedding system. And there's 4 stages in regards to the Jewish wedding system. And the Jewish wedding system we're talking about here is the Jewish wedding practice or during Jesus' time. So it would have been the ancient Jewish practice of this time that Jesus is around, and that's the stages that we'll be looking at. So there's the 4 stages. Of course, the first one there is the bride price stage. So in the Jewish wedding system, what would happen here first is the father of the groom would make arrangements. When they make the arrangements, this is the father, what he does is he pays what they call the bride price. So that's what the father arranges. If you've been in Africa and a lot of these other third world countries, you would often, when I was fortunate to be in South Africa, I'm sure Josie would be familiar with this, there was always a bride price that the groom-to-be would have to save up before they take a father's daughter in hand. So here it's a similar thing here. So this is what the father of the groom, what he does is make those arrangements for the marriage and then pays what the bride price is. Now the timing of this varies in this culture within the wedding system here in the Jewish frame. And sometimes it can happen when both children are small. So it can happen, this is probably at least where it might be prearranged, but the timing of this can happen when the bride or groom-to-be are small, and there could be an agreement between the families. In other times, it's usually a year. This takes place a year before the marriage itself takes place. So often the bride and groom don't really meet each other really until their wedding day. So that's quite often what happens, So that's the first stage. Now the second step is what they call the fetching of the bride, and this step occurs a year or more after the first step, the previous step. And what happens here is the bridegroom would go to the home of the bride in order to bring her to his home. So connected with the previous step, there's 2 things that should be noted at this stage. And the first thing is it was the father of the groom who actually determined the timing. So that's what happens, and that's what you should know. We should note in terms of this timing. So the father is the one, father of the groom is the one who determines the timing. And then the second thing is before or prior to the groom's leaving to fetch the bride, the practice is that the groom to be must have a place prepared for his bride to be. So in other words, that he should have already organised to have a place prepared for them to go to. So that's the second stage here. Come to the third stage of the Jewish wedding stage is the wedding ceremony. Now, this third step here is only a few are actually invited at the wedding ceremony. So there are only probably immediate family members, and only certain distinguished guests are invited at this stage. But before this ceremony occurs, what happens is the bride undergoes a ritual immersion for ritual cleansing. And so that's what the bride undertakes at the third stage of the wedding ceremony. Yeah, so there's few invited guests at this point, and also the bride undergoes a ritual immersion. And the fourth step is what we call the marriage feast. What follows is, of course, the marriage feast, and this could last. It's been noted is that it can last for about 7 days. Hey, that'd be a lot of food to feed your guests, but that's how long this part of the wedding stage lasts for. Is could last as long as 7 days. And what happens here is more people than were at the wedding ceremony invited to the feast. So so a lot more people are invited at this stage here. Of course, for us Polynesians, that's natural, especially us islanders. We doesn't matter if you get an invite or not, whether you turn up at the wedding ceremony, you'll definitely turn up at the wedding, at the marriage feast anyway. So those are the 4 stages of the Jewish wedding system that we're observing here. And that's the background that it's good for us to understand from a Jewish frame of reference the wedding system, because that will make sense when we interpret what some of the passages that Jesus is talking about, especially around the marriage, and also it helps us put in perspective the last 2 things of this chapter that we talked about in terms of the rapture and in terms of some of the other things that we've noted as well. So when we look, having this as a backdrop, when we look at this term, the marriage of the Lamb, which is what this part of this book we've arrived at, we can make an actual we can make a comparison to the Jewish wedding system itself. In fact, it follows pretty much the same stages, and let's look at it at each stage and how it relates to the marriage of the Lamb. So just in the first stage there, in terms of the bride price stage of the Jewish wedding system, we also see that God, the Father, makes an arrangement and pays the bride price. And so that bride price is, of course, his son's blood. Remember, the church we're referred to as the bride. That's a key note to understand. And God Father makes an arrangement for us, the church, to be married to his son, and the price that God the Father pays is, of course, the blood of his son. Now, this is really what the background for Ephesians 5:25 to 27. This is a passage most of us are familiar with, I guess, when we were talking about relation between the husbands and wives. But the background to that is this first part of the terms of the bride price, or the stage that God made this arrangement. And it says there, husbands, love your wives, even as Christ also loved the church and gave himself up for it, that he might sanctify it, having cleansed it by the washing of water with the word, that he might present the church to himself, a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that it should be holy and without blemish. Ephesians 5, verses 25 to 27. So, another thing to note is that remember, there was a long period in the previous wedding system. There was, just as there was a period of at least 1 year after the father makes an arrangement between the first and second steps of the Jewish marriage arrangement system. What we see is the same situation will happen here, right? So what we've seen is that there's been about, since the Messiah's crucifixion and resurrection, there's been at least a period of 2,000 years that have actually passed. So in terms of from when the arrangement of the father and paying the bride price, remember there is a gap, just like in the Jewish wedding system. And so there is that gap that we're waiting for, and that's about 2,000 years. So you see that in 1 Thessalonians 4, 13 to 18, if you look at those passages. I haven't written those passages out full, but if you can take a note of those passages. Matthew 24, 36 is another one. John 1, verses 1 to 3. And so what those describes there is the second step, which will occur. So the rapture is the fetching of the bride. So that's the second step that we are looking at now. And so, of course, that's still to happen, but that's the second stage in regards to what we call here the fetching of the bride, is the rapture. So it will only happen once, and it will only happen once the place of residence has been prepared, as in John 14, verses 1 to 3. In fact, that, so you know that I've written it wrong there it's not John 1, it's John 14, verses 1 to 3. Yeah, my fingers are too big to type. But the point is, this is when, you remember when Jesus referred to, I will go away and prepare a mansion for you? Well, he's doing that in terms of from a wedding Jewish system point of view, and this is what a groom would normally do, is that once the arrangement's been made, this is before they get married, what happens is the father's paid the price. Now what Jesus is doing is now he has to go and prepare a place for us, just like a Jewish husband would do for his bride. And so when the house is finished, that's when we could expect the Messiah to return for us, because he would have finished preparing a home for us. And so that's when he comes back for the church, which is the body of Messiah. Right? This is the invisible church. I had a really good discussion with AJ last week, and he mentioned another thing too, is that the physical church is what will still remain. The Lord will only come for the invisible church. So the physical church that will still remain, of course, the physical building, and of course the body of believers that obviously aren't believers if they're still behind, that's what will be left behind, and not the invisible body or the universal body of the church, the true church, which the Messiah will come back for in the rapture. So so that's what will happen here, and this is the second part, which is fetching the bride. Hey, something for us to look forward to, the rapture, and taking us to our homes as well. The next stage, just like in the previous Jewish wedding system stage, is the third stage, which is called the wedding ceremony. And if we look at Revelation chapter 19, verses 6 to 8, and I heard, as it were, the voice of a great multitude, and as the voice of many waters, and as the voice of mighty thunders, saying, Hallelujah! For the Lord our God, the Almighty, reigns. Let us rejoice and be exceeding glad, and let us give the glory unto him. For the marriage of the Lamb is come, and his wife has made herself ready. And it was given unto her that she should array herself in fine linen, bright and pure. For the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. So that's found in Revelation 19, 6 to 8. Now, the point here is the marriage ceremony takes place in heaven, and it involves, of course, the church, which is us, the body of Messiah. Now, in terms of if you're looking at the timing of it, this would obviously happen straight after the judgment seat of Messiah that we've just, remember, we just been raptured, and then what happens after we're raptured, we stand before the Messiah, what they call the judgment seat of Messiah, where all of our works are judged. And it's from, and that's what's, if you look at verse 8, the bride is being viewed as being dressed in white linen. Now that's the clue there. White linen, which is the righteous acts of the saints. Now, of course, after the judgment seat of Christ, the bride has become purified. And remember, then what happens is that after that process, after all of the wood, hay and stubble has been burned away, and the gold, silver, and precious stones have been purified. And this is straight after the rapture. And then once that takes place, then the groom brings the bride with him to his home. And then following the judgment seat of Messiah, which results in the bride having those white linen garments, and then the wedding ceremony then takes place at this point here in heaven. So in terms of timing, just to be clear, this takes place before the actual second coming of the Messiah. Now this is where some have confused this part as being part of the rapture after just before the millennial at the end of tribulation, but this event happens before the second coming of Messiah. This is the wedding ceremony. So, and what we see here is the judgment seat of, remember the part of the where the bride has to go through that immersion cleaning process that we just spoke of before. The judgment seat of Messiah corresponds to that Jewish practice in regards to the cleansing of the bride, if that makes sense. Eh? So that's the correlation, or what that corresponds to. Eh? So that's the similar action that will happen. So that after the judgment seat of Christ, we as the church or the bride become purified, and then we're ready to be with the Messiah. Now, just some context in regards to Revelation 19. When you look at that chapter, you're going to be seeing that from verses 1 to 10 of Revelation chapter 19, it describes events in heaven before the second coming. And then what you'll see is that in verses 11 to 21 of the same chapter, it describes the second coming and subsequent events. So the thing that should be carefully noted here is that what we know is that the church is already in heaven before the second coming. That's the thing needs to be carefully noted here, is the church is already in heaven before the second coming. Now, we know that the church has been in heaven long enough to undergo the judgment seat of Messiah. And so this clearly means that the rapture and the second coming can't be the same thing. So it has to be separated by some duration of time. So marriage ceremony will take place in heaven after the rapture, but before the second coming. And of course, it only involves the church saints. Now, the fourth step, so that's the wedding ceremony. And the fourth stage, or the fourth step in regards to the marriage of the Lamb, is the marriage feast. And this will take place on earth. So this feast will take place on earth, but it will take place on earth after the second coming. And this begins as a celebration before the Messianic kingdom begins after the tribulation. So this is the part of it, which is the marriage feast. Now, the key thing to note here is this is where the Messiah's kingdom parables. Remember those kingdom parables that I spoke of last year at some point, where they refer to this in terms of the marriage feast in Matthew 22, 1 to 14, 25, 1 to 13, is what they refer this marriage feast to. Now, the marriage ceremony, the one that we looked at just before this, remember that involves only the church. Just like in the Jewish system, where only a few were invited there in terms of the wedding ceremony, not everyone was invited there, only a few, select few. The same here in this process, because the Old Testament saints aren't in the wedding ceremony, but here in the marriage feast, those Old Testament saints, and includes the tribulation saints, will be part of this part of the marriage feast. So the rest of the invitations will be sent to, well, they'll be invited anyway. So the Old Testament saints, tribulation saints, will be invited at this marriage feast before we all enter into the millennium kingdom. I guess another thing to also note at this point, it's good to look at the categories of believers. So if we're talking about believers before the cross, they should be referred to as Old Testament saints. If we're talking about believers after the cross, before the tribulation to be exact, you're talking about church saints. And then if you're talking about believers during the tribulation, they are referred to as the tribulation saints. So those are the three categories, and that's probably good to understand those three categories, so then we don't make a confusion about who's where and who's going to turn up at what part of the process. It was a good question Marge raised last week, is regards to the awards, whether is that awards we get at the end after the tribulation? No, the award ceremony is for the church saints only, where we are determined, judged on our works since the cross. So church saints only from the cross till now, and that our works will be judged, and that determines what our authority is in the millennium kingdom. The Old Testament saints won't be there, and of course, obviously, neither will the tribulation saints for those rewards. But we'll all be, we'll all have a marriage feast at this part here, in this stage of the marriage of the Lamb. So that's what will take place on the earth. Now, in chapter 15, on your timeline, and I'll go back to our timeline to look at that, so then we can get refreshed on that. But more details in regards to this fourth step, we'll go into more detail in it in chapter 15. And this will be during the 75-day interval. Remember, on our timeline, there's the tribulation, then Jesus returns the second coming, and then there's a 75-day interval period before the millennium kingdom happens. And it's during that 75-day period that this fourth step will we'll look at it a bit more in detail. Now there are other events. So these are the kind of the what we call the kind of the main events that's discussed in chapter 6. But there is another event that we will talk about in chapter 7, and that's really in regards to the 24 elders. For those of you who may be familiar with those passages, and we need to look at that in the next chapter. And once we go through that in chapter 7, then that concludes this part of, remember the three categories, that what John saw and then what come to pass, and then we begin tribulation in chapter 8. Is the Great Tribulation. We'll look at the introduction to that, But if we look at this timeline that I've got in front of us, just to give us a quick refresh of where we're at, So in terms of that timeline, in the beginning there is the bride price, which was Christ. That's the first stage of the marriage of the Lamb. So God the Father makes arrangements, then he pays the bride price, which began with the sacrifice of our Lord, paid by his blood. And then, of course, there's an interval time. So it's been 2,000 years, remember, just like in the Jewish wedding system, there's at least a year or maybe more after the arrangement. Then what happens is the groom comes back to fetch the bride. And it's in the stage 2, which the Messiah, remember, he promises the bride that I'll go away to prepare a mansion for us. And in his Father's place there are many mansions. And so it's in the rapture that is the second stage for us. So that could happen any time now. And so that is the rapture, is the fetching of the bride stage. When we're raptured, we go into heaven. So before the tribulation happens, we are fetched by the rapture. We enter into heaven with the Lord, and we stand before the Lord in judgment seat of Christ. Now, the judgment seat of Christ is where we, the church believers, judge on our works. Remember, not judge on our sins. Our sins were already dealt with in the cross. What's dealt with up there is our works that we've done in the name of the Messiah. And all of the wood, rubble, and all that stuff will be burnt away. The only stuff that will be kept behind is gold, silver, and precious metals. And so that's what happens in heaven when we're there. Then after that, of course, the marriage of the Lamb begins, of course, the third stage, and that happens in the heaven where the ceremony occurs. Remember the wedding ceremony, and it's only us. It doesn't involve the Old Testament saints. And then the next stage, which is the fourth one, which is the marriage feast. Remember, while we're up in heaven, guess what's happening on earth during those 7 years is the tribulation. The tribulation is what will be happening while we're in heaven. And then once that ceremony is complete, we come back down to earth where the marriage feast begins, where all of our brothers from the Old Testament will join us, and also the surviving all of the tribulations believers that went through the 7 years tribulation will also join us as well. And then there will be a preparation and a feast before the 1,000 years begin, And then, of course, there's the eternal order at the end of those 1,000 years. But that concludes chapter 6 in regards to the marriage of the Lamb.